Welcome, everybody. Welcome. My name's David Wood. It's my privilege and pleasure to chair London Futurists. Today's topic is the creation of sovereign money and basic income. And in a moment, we'll introduce the speaker. But before that, I should point out that today's event is jointly hosted by London Futurists and Radix, the think tank for the Radical Centre. And to say a few words about Radix, I'm very pleased to welcome one of their board members and trustees, Nick Silver, who is an actuary and an economist whose specialities include risk management, social insurance, and environmental finance. Nick, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, David, for the introduction, and thank you for hosting us. And we're delighted to do our first ever joint event with the London Futurists. Hopefully will be the first of many. Radix is a think tank. We've been around for about 3 or 4 years of the Radical Centre. What does that mean? Well, it means that we're not like wedded to old ideas of left and right, but we view the world through a systems perspective, the political and economic systems, and you can't just tinker, change things. You have to look at how system works and then make interventions that bring about kind of radical change. So for a good example of this would be introducing digital currency. That is not a left or right policy, but it is definitely a radical change, and we bring lessons from business, industry, technology to in the UK, our sclerotic political system, and we've also got branches in Spain and Italy and the Netherlands. I wouldn't say I'm a particularly expert in money or monetary, but I have written a book called Finance, Society and Sustainability. You should never miss an opportunity to plug your book. But by the way, it's a fantastic book. It's the best book on the financial system. Just to plug Radix's next event, we have an event about the NHS, the UK's public health system, and it's a critical evaluation of it. It's on Tuesday, 6 o'clock PM UK time.
A few words about London Futurists. We are an informal meetup who share the view that it is worthwhile to think seriously about the future. It's not a waste of time. It's not just a bit of fun. It's a very serious topic because, after all, the world is changing more quickly than was previously expected. We're more connected than before. We're not just connected biologically, so that biological viruses and bacteria can spread their way around the world to devastating effect more quickly. We're connected psychologically, so that psychological viruses can spread the world more quickly, changing people's behavior. And not just bad ideas, but also good ideas can arguably change the world more quickly than before. And we're connected from our IT points of view as well. So there is hacking, not just of our biology, but hacking of our IT systems, again, possibly for good and bad. There are many other ways in which technology is poised to change the world, with potential breakthroughs in the worlds of medicine, rejuvenation biotechnology, improvements for our mental health care, possibly, improvements in fields such as nanotechnology and quantum computing, and very famously in the worlds of automation and information technology. And the world is changing also because we humans are having a heavier impact on parts of our environment than ever before. Some ways we are treading more lightly, but in other ways we are treading more heavily, causing extreme weather and other environmental setbacks. And in some ways we humans are treading more heavily than ever before on each other, causing alienation, causing feelings of separation, causing feelings of tribalism and partisanship. And although there are many good trends as well, there are many reasons to worry. And the future won't just come out of any one of these trends. The most interesting, the most disturbing, the most promising angles for the future typically involve combinations of these different trends. And that's where we require some imagination to project ahead what these interactions may be, but also a lot of critical thinking to make sense of these possibilities. And that's what we try to do at London Futurists. And today's topic, I think, fits that pattern. We're not just going to talk about one trend. I think there's probably at least 4 major ideas which are going to be involved together. There is the future of our social safety net, more people feeling bruised or troubled by various changes in society, and the previous social safety net doesn't seem to be working. there are changes in the world of economics and finance, different ideas, radical different ideas about how we should pay for some of the social programs that we would like to see. Then there's the change of work by increasing automation, by increasingly powerful technological firms, and of course, by the changes due to the social distancing that has been put in place as a result of the pandemic. And these changes have accelerated in some ways the move towards automation. And the last change is a reevaluation of the meaning of human dignity. If humans can no longer find their dignity in a long-term career, the way that was often thought to be our future, where will we find dignity? And what is the implications for all the other trends? So having said all that, I'll just briefly say a few words about today's speaker, Jeff Crocker. His first degree was in economics, then he did a master's in philosophy of science, and has had a fascinating career in global technology strategy consulting, involving various rather large companies such as IBM, Yamaha, Kone, and ABB. He has also been involved in projects in Russia and in other countries such as Kenya, Ghana, and South Africa, and even in Bristol, where he established Bristol care homes with a mission statement to provide high quality, holistic nursing care for elderly people. And as you'll hear, he has given a lot of thought into the issues about the topics of today. I'm now going to hand over to Jeff.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, everybody who's attending this afternoon's seminar. I see we've got colleagues from Germany. I see Anna and Valentin, and we've got colleagues from the United States, Alex and Derek, and far-flung from Japan. Welcome to Miyai from Okinawa. So a worldwide webinar this afternoon. I'm going to aim to put the case across in about 20 to 25 minutes. I'll be aiming to present the case from technology in favor of basic income and in favor of debt-free sovereign money. And I'll be arguing that technology makes basic income not just a nice thing, but a necessity. It also makes debt-free sovereign money a necessity. Therefore, there's a consistency in the argument because debt-free sovereign money provides funding for the proposal for basic income. And then there'll be a Q&A session, but please do use that to make a wide range of comments. I'm not pretending to be the guru that can answer every question, although I will try to field questions, but I'll be very interested in your comments, your critiques, your challenges, which will help me to refine, develop and correct the argument further. So here we are, Sovereign Money and Basic Income presentation for London Futurists and the Radix think tank. Here is an outline case for basic income. There are bullet points covering 5 arguments in favor of basic income. One is social justice, the idea that basic income will address inequality, it will address the precarity in the labor market at the moment, and it will make the sharing of the infrastructure and the technology that we all inherit fairer than it is today. That's an argument put forward by my colleague Guy Standing in many of his books and presentations. Secondly, the best welfare system. If we're going to have any welfare system whatsoever, basic income is the best because compared to means-tested benefits, it's less intrusive, it's therefore lower cost, it has a higher uptake because it's an automatic uptake, and furthermore, it has no work disincentive. It's often argued that basic income will disincentivize work. In fact, it's the current welfare systems that disincentivize work because the minute you get a job, you lose your benefits pound for pound, which you don't with a basic income. Therefore, basic income avoids so-called unemployment and poverty traps. The third point, which I'll be arguing in the presentation, is about the need of the macroeconomy to have income fed through to people and the increasing failure of the economy to feed income through as is needed. And therefore, it will avoid debt, crisis, and austerity. That I will explain more in the presentation. Fourthly, it has ecological benefits because a basic income breaks this link between income and yet further output in consumption, and therefore resource depletion and pollution. And finally, but not least importantly, it enables human flourishing. It enables us to see that we have a wider choice of lifestyle than the 9-to-5 office or the 8-to-4 factory. And in the bubble there, you'll see the website ubi.org, where there's more presented on those arguments. So we come to this issue of funding basic income. It's often the challenge is that basic income is either too small to be meaningful or it's too large to be affordable. So what are the funding options? Well, here I set on the left-hand side a variety of funding options that are often advanced and some comment on them. So if we start with revenue neutral proposals for basic income, which are in the proposals, for example, in the report from Compass or from the Citizens Basic Income Trust, they would essentially fund basic income by slightly higher taxation, perhaps about 3%, and by replacing other benefits. The comment there is that therefore the only change achieved is unconditionality and less intrusion, i.e. the benefit becomes automatic and there's no intrusion to make sure that people fulfill the conditions. That's an important move, but is it sufficient? Wealth taxes are often proposed. My comment there is that, first of all, wealth taxes are pretty difficult to manage because people hold their wealth in a range of assets. So whilst there's 12 trillion pounds of wealth held in the UK, of course, that includes people's houses. It includes shares in companies. It may include luxury goods and bank balance accounts. But nevertheless, the ability to tax that range of assets is at least challenging. You know, will the state accept PLC shares, for example, or will it require people to sell those PLC shares? There is actually also a wealth tax existing, i.e. inheritance tax exists at a 40% rate. So it's not as though there's a lack of a tax on wealth, but open to discussion on that. People also advocate land tax. My comment there is that actually today, land is much less important than it was in an agricultural economy. So as we move from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy to an information economy, we find that the most profitable companies, the so-called FANG companies, the Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google, and Microsoft and so on, these are the hugely profitable companies which may use very little land. So a land tax would not address their huge profitabilities and leave them with a very low contribution. Eco-tax is also advanced. My argument there is, well, actually, eco-taxes are there to try to eliminate pollution, to try to eliminate emission, and therefore an eco-tax is not a valid long-term reliable source of funding for anything. It should be self-cancelling over time. And sovereign fund investments often suggested, which requires one of the above to build up a sovereign wealth fund. And I've put some arguments which you might like to respond to later as to why I think those proposals are heavily qualified. So we move into sovereign money creation, which is a very heterodox paradigm, a real change in the structure and nature of the economy. And in the presentation, I'll try to show how I get there. We're all aware that at the moment, the present economic system has lots of dysfunctionality in it. It is producing goods, services, and employment, but at the same time, it's ridden with a number of faults. The fault lines are crisis, which happened in 2007, 2008, and could very well happen again. It's riddled with debt. There is pervasive debt at both household level and at government level. Government debts exceeding the whole of the GDP per year. There is the application of austerity policy that we've certainly seen in the UK for the last 10 years. There is extensive poverty, including in-work poverty. And that gives us a clue that work is no longer the guarantee to an adequacy of income. Work and wage are beginning to fail as the deliverers of an adequate standard of living. So we see low-paid jobs, so-called bullshit jobs with low job satisfaction ratings. We see vastly increased inequality. You only have to read Thomas Piketty to see how extreme these levels of inequality have become. We see ecological damage. That's a package of fault lines which are pretty severe. And my suggestion is that needs a pretty radical rethink and a re-engineering of the economic system. When we look back to that economic crisis, the usual explanation, and I think it's a faulty explanation, is what I call the bad guy theory, i.e. the crisis happened because bad banks created too much debt and bad governments failed to regulate. The corrections that were applied were tighter bank regulation, quantitative easing, and austerity. But since it's not working, we need to question that diagnostic. And really, is simultaneous universal malpractice? Did all banks do the wrong thing in every country at the same time? Did all governments do the wrong thing in every country at the same time? Actually, that's a rather tenuous hypothesis. What really caused this debt explosion? Well, I'm going to suggest that the crisis was caused by more structural factors than by behavioral factors. So I'm avoiding the blame game and getting down to some issues to do with the fundamental structure of the economy that led us into crisis, that led us into austerity, and which argues towards basic income. Now, on this slide, I've tried to show what my basic argument is. That we work from technology through towards the advocacy for basic income. So on the left there, automation is constantly increasing productivity. And it's been doing this all the way through the whole industrial revolution from day one. And in the 19th century, saw huge gains in productivity of textiles, for example, and all other goods and services. So actually, the real price of nearly everything has kept on reducing and making us, generally speaking, better off. So in the small print there, I'm talking about productivity which increases output, physical real output per hour worked, which is reducing wages per unit of output and is leaving real wages lagging that productivity. Now, in the box at the top, you often hear this argument about technology. Oh, it's because the robots are coming, they're going to destroy all jobs. And then people say, they look out the window and say, well, the robots are not ubiquitous yet, and we've still got full employment. So this argument is dismissed. Well, first of all, it's not yet, but it's the next phase. And secondly, the argument from automation is rather more subtle. And this is what I've tried to show here. So working from that top left box, the number one effect is that automation, by reducing the demand for labor, initially unskilled labor, but increasingly now more and more skilled labor, is reducing labor bargaining power. Those two effects together, box 2 at the bottom, are splitting the labor market, the employment sector, into high-paid specialty jobs and low-paid bullshit jobs, and massively increasing inequality. And number 3 in the box above, this is having the effect of sucking income out of the economy. And so when we look at measures like the aggregate of all wages paid across the economy, we see them reducing proportionately as a percentage of GDP, the gross national product, and of the percentage of consumer spend. And that's the test of the hypothesis, which I'll explore in the next couple of slides. This situation with declining consumer incomes is forcing households into increased debt, particularly low-pay households having to go to payday lenders, increasing their debt at astronomical levels of interest rates. And we're seeing an increase in government welfare spend to meet the poverty that's resulting. As a result of that, household debt escalates and we run into crisis. And if people think that the COVID period has led to people having more saved income, Andy Haldane, the economist at the Bank of England, made this comment in the press recently, that may be true for high income households. It's certainly not true for lower income households, as the article in The Guardian, which I highlight above a couple of days ago, points out. And we see at the same time government debt increase hit a ceiling, and that ceiling then imposes austerity, which I define there as the unnecessary redundancy of available resources. And that leads to, in the bottom right-hand box, an increase in poverty, increase in inequality, damage to the ecology, and damage to human well-being. So that's the overall structural explanation that I'm trying to explore. So how does technology have this kind of effect and require basic income and sovereign money? Well, in a thought experiment, I suggest we plug a machine into Earth. This machine's a fully automated economy. It can produce all the goods and services that we want without any labor and therefore without any wages. Now, in this mythical thought experiment, how does income get to consumers? The only way is for vouchers to be distributed to people. They hand those vouchers in for the goods and services they choose. Those vouchers are destroyed each year and a new set issued the next year. Now, in that thought experiment, 100% of the GDP of the economy is basic income, and 100% is also sovereign money issued debt-free, like coinages at the moment. So this is an extreme argument, of course, but the more nuanced argument from that is that in high-tech economies, there is an essential need for unearned income in the economy. And the best form of that earned income is basic income, unconditional universal income paid to each citizen without conditionality. It also argues that in the high-tech economy, sovereign money is also essential to fund that basic income and government expenditure. So therefore, sovereign money is the consistent proposal for funding basic income. The empirical evidence I suggest we can gather towards this is, first of all, as I will show, earned income has declined against consumer expenditure consistently over the last 70 years. Secondly, huge household debt is being built up all the time. And I suggest this is a surrogate for the missing basic income that should be there. At the same time, huge government debt is accumulated, which is a surrogate for the missing sovereign money, which should be there. Further evidence is recent that the Bank of England, I'll go into this in further detail, has recently purchased 875 billion of government bonds, which I will argue is very equivalent to a quasi form of debt-free sovereign money, because it's only the state owing itself. And I noticed that Ida, welcome to you, is on our call today. The Institute for Policy Research project at the University of Bath is coming out with results which are showing that technology is the factor which is reducing the labour share of GDP. So, labour income is declining consistently over the last 70 years, and this graph here shows that. In 1948, labour income, what we earned as wages and from employment, covered our consumer expenditure. That continued to be the case until 1995, and since then, labour income has been insufficient for consumer expenditure. So that graph, which is inexorable long-term restructuring of the economy, does support the hypothesis that automation is sucking income out of the economy, that we are seeing a delinkage of productivity and real wages. And the argument, I'll point out, relies on automation. It doesn't rely on growth. So the argument also applies to degrowth proposals, which I know many colleagues are interested in. And here is a recent contribution of German data showing a similar picture, that consumer expenditure is growing far faster than labour income. So the second tranche of empirical evidence of the hypothesis is that, of course, as we know, debt is everywhere. Here is UK household debt at 1.28 trillion in 2018. It's equal to 61% of the GDP. And although much of it is held against property, as we also know, many people extend their mortgage in order to fund consumer expenditure. And we've seen a 12 billion increase in that debt in the period from 14-16 to 16-18. At the same time, debt everywhere. Here are national debts. The UK is now well above 80% of its GDP as its national debt. And on the right hand diagram, you see the winner is Japan, with 234% of its GDP as its national debt. Now, of course, these debts are not repayable, and therefore they're mythical. They're called debts, but they're not debts. They're not going to be repaid. So my suggestion is that we, if you like, get real about this, and we redefine our economic structure in line with reality. What these debts do impose, of course, is a servicing charge. So in the UK, the annual servicing charge is now in excess of £39 billion a year. Do we need to go that way? That debt, of course, then constrains government expenditure because of what Stephanie Kelton calls the deficit myth. And governments feel they can't incur any more of this debt. So we see household debt and government debt constraining expenditure. We see poverty, including in-work poverty, with austerity policy. And therefore, I'm suggesting we take some conceptual first steps to replace household debt with basic income and to replace government debt with sovereign money to restore austerity cuts. So this means a bit of theory about money, and forgive me for these couple of slides. The orthodox theory of money here is that money has some kind of inherent value, which it derives either by the gold standard or currently from the sale of government bonds which create debt. That's where it's thought in orthodoxy that money gets its value from. Money is thought to be real. It can't be created or destroyed. Government budgets are supposed to balance. Household and government expenditure become debt financed and therefore limited. And affordability is defined by government financial reserves, compared to the more heterodox view of sovereign money, which is that money has no inherent value. There is actually a magical money tree. We all know that in reality, at a keystroke, governments can create billions. It derives its value from its relative measurement against output GDP. The sovereign state can issue money versus GDP without creating debt. Sovereign money is needed in high technology economies. Household and government expenditure is funded, and affordability is defined by real resources and productive potential, not by the intermediate variable of government financial reserves. So again, one more slide on the theory of money before we move on. How to define sovereign money. There are three definitions here. One is the School of Modern Money Theory, well represented by Stephanie Kelton in her book, The Deficit Myth, and also by Randall Wray in his book on modern money theory. MMT feels that sovereign money is basically intended to fund a job guarantee program, Medicare for all, and a Green New Deal, speaking out of the US context. Money creation, they maintain, should still assume debt, which is what I'm clearly disagreeing with. The debt that's created is balanced by other surpluses in the economy by a rather complicated route through an identity defined by Wynne Godley. And zero interest rates creates no revenue financing cost. Second definition by my friend and colleague Joseph Huber in his book Sovereign Money is that sovereign money should become a state monopoly. So commercial banks currently create money, cause the crisis. They should be constrained by that from doing that, and only the state should create sovereign money. My definition is somewhat different to that. Sovereign money, in my view, funds aggregate demand to full output GDP. Money creation is debt-free, avoids excessive consumer and public sector debt, eliminates, this is interesting, because it eliminates the intermediate arbitrage that you get by all the bond trading that goes on at the moment, therefore reduces the financialization of the economy. And it returns seigniorage, i.e., the difference between the value of money created and the cost of creating that money. It returns that seigniorage back to the state through a tax on commercial bank money creation. And there, not to go through it again, but there's a table summarizing those three definitions. Here I've tried to show that in a little diagram. Apologies for the complexity, but that I think is how it looks. So best to read bottom up. We're all familiar with consumers and firms. We buy things from firms. The purchases go one way, the wages go the other way. Both pay taxes up to the national and local government at the top left. Pension insurance companies both take pension contribution from consumers and pay pensions out to retirees. Banks make loans and take interest payments. And then essentially the government sells its bonds to the pension and insurance companies and to wealthy individuals. And the bonds are then sold back to the central bank, because in most economies, the central bank is not able to buy bonds directly from the government. So in that complex diagram, I've shown in a pecked line how sovereign money would work and how QE would go directly to the people instead of into the banks. So the life of bonds, how do these government bonds work, and what are their unintended consequences? Well, currently, of course, governments spend their funding, A, by raising taxation, and B, by borrowing. So recent huge COVID spending on various programs has led to a lot of creation of government bonds. The Debt Management Office is selling these gilts to insurance companies and pension funds. At the same time, several of the mutual funds, foreign central banks, wealthy individuals, and hedge funds have had an investor flight. They've had lots of withdrawals and therefore have had to refinance themselves by selling their holdings of government bonds. There's been a huge sale of government bonds. The Bank of England has intervened to purchase these gilts in the secondary market because it's wanted to maintain their price in order to maintain low yields and low interest rates. This generates, and this is a valid critique, I think, it generates risk-free margin to the intermediaries. So the pension funds and the insurance companies who are buying the government bonds to fund the government expenditure are then selling them back to the Bank of England, making a margin without any risk. So the Bank of England, as I said earlier, now holds 875 billion of government debt, equivalent to debt-free sovereign money. And there's a diagram which is easier to see of Bank of England gilt holdings since the asset purchase facility, growing from virtually zero to a current level of 875 billion. What would life without bonds look like? And I've cheekily called this the ultimate liberation theology, i.e., what would debt-free sovereign money look like? Well, I'm arguing that debt-free sovereign money, radical as it sounds, is demonstrably feasible. And I have two empirical bits of evidence there. One is cash, because cash, banknotes and coins are currently issued without the government assuming any debt. Okay, it's only 3% of the money base, but it does demonstrate the feasibility of debt-free sovereign money. And secondly, as I've already mentioned twice, the current existence of 875 billion pounds worth of Bank of England holdings of government debt is equivalent to debt-free sovereign money and demonstrates its feasibility. It's convincingly preferable. Why? Because it eliminates this myth of national debts that are several times of the GDP and can never be repaid. It eliminates their debt servicing costs, which are significant. It enables necessary income to be fed through to households and to fund government welfare expenditure, therefore eliminates crisis because it takes the consumer debt out of the system. It eliminates austerity because it takes away the financial deficit constraint. It reduces the financialization of the economy, and there shouldn't be an apostrophe there, huge profit take. And it returns seigniorage, which is very considerable, to the state. Many people are concerned about inflation. So they say, but isn't UBI and debt-free sovereign money going to be terribly inflationary? And my response to that would be as follows. First of all, UBI and sovereign money does not take us to Weimar and does not take us to Zimbabwe, because hyperinflation requires a breakdown in the real supply sector of the economy. And we don't have a breakdown in the real supply sector of the economy. The factories, the restaurants, the transport mechanisms, they're all there and working. All economies print and create money. The question is not whether you should print or create money. The question is how much. So therefore, we have to obey the rule of all economic management that total aggregate demand is less than output GDP. This is implemented by regular, well-established Keynesian and monetary demand management, whether it's by fiscal mechanisms of taxation to keep aggregate demand within output, or whether it's monetary mechanisms by the interest rate. So I suggest if we simply were to consider replacing existing levels of household debt with UBI and replacing existing levels of government debt with debt-free sovereign money, by definition, that would not be inflationary, because we'd be simply redefining the debt that exists as not debt. we need to always observe the rule that the sum of all demand in the economy, including UBI, is less than output GDP. So, to sum up, we have a paradigm shift from two crises, i.e. the economic crisis of 2007-8 and the COVID crisis of 2020. And that has led to a demonstration of the feasibility of UBI and debt-free sovereign money, because the Bank of England holds 875 billion of government bonds, equivalent to sovereign money. And the furlough scheme of 3 million people and the $1,200 checks per person in the USA are a quasi-demonstration of UBI working. So that would end us up in this benign economic paradigm. Remember, we started with a very dysfunctional economic paradigm. Here's the benign nirvana that we would end up with instead, i.e. output GDP determines our ability to issue debt-free sovereign money. That funds government expenditure welfare benefits, and it also funds a basic income for consumer expenditure. We get rid of austerity. We see poverty and inequality reduced. We see ecological outcomes improved. We see human flourishing, no crisis, and a reduced financialization of the economy in its bond markets and its seigniorage. And finally, my book on the subject, Basic Income and Sovereign Money, which I present without any guilty conscience because I get zero royalties from it. But that's there also on the website. So thank you for listening. And David, over to you to share people's comments.
Well, Jeff, you have given us so much to think about, and there's already 14 questions in the Q&A. And I suspect that many of the questions arrived in the first 2/3 of your talks. So I encourage people to think very carefully as well about what you said in later stages. So put your questions in the Q&A window, and also help me out, please, by voting on which questions that are in that window you think deserve most of our time and attention. And a very quick one first, Jeff. People are asking if your PowerPoint will be available.
It is from my point of view. I don't know through your system, David, how it would be accessed. I'm happy to make it totally available, yeah.
So you can put it on one of your websites, ubi.org or something else, or by all means.
It'll certainly be on ubi.org in a couple of days, yeah.
Fine. Before I turn to the audience, I'd like to give Nick Silver, who is one of the board members and trustees of Radix, a chance to offer some initial comments. Nick, what did you think?
Great. Well, thank you. First of all, that was a wonderful talk, really interesting and well argued. I agree with quite a lot of it, but not all of it. In fact, you had me most of the way until the end. So if you split it up into two things, UBI and sort of debt-free digital currency. So UBI, to some extent, I think, to a limited extent, I think it's a good idea. First of all, in certain circumstances, I'm quite confident that we'll get to a situation, but we're nowhere near that now, of the robots taking over and replacing AI, replacing jobs, right? And then you will need at some point in the future maybe to go to, but that's a risk. It's not a certainty, right? And then also, I think the biggest case for you guys for sort of very poor people in the world. So they're X billion people less than $2 a day, and why not just pay them $2 a day, right? And that would and there are lots of charities which do that, where you can just transfer money to provide people with income. And I think we need sort of a guaranteed right that people on the planet, or you could avoid great deal of poverty, and really at very low cost, right? That would be. And then there are also kind of potential UBI options, which of things that citizens are entitled to, like things like the carbon tax and distribute. So we charge tax on carbon, and then as you said, that this would actually reduce our carbon usage, so that take will go down. But that's the property of everyone, so distribute it to everyone. And when governments do quantitative easing, why give it to banks, bondholders? You could just distribute to helicopter money to everyone. That would be much fairer, much less redistribute positively rather than negatively, progressively rather than regressively, and things like micropayments to data. But those are sort of small, relatively small and irregular payments to people. They're not enough to give people an income that they could live on. But I think there are no regrets, no brain. Then digital money, I entirely agree with you that you know, I had a slide when I used to give a talk about this, explaining our current way of creating money, right? And it's like, it seemed, if you're explaining this to an alien, it would seem a totally crazy, ludicrous system where debts issue, so banks create money for debt, right? And it creates a massive, which you didn't mention, but I'm sure you agree, a massive misallocation of capital, gives a huge amount of power to intermediaries, as you hinted at. And I think actually the misallocation of capital is the biggest crime in our current system. And we haven't got, we now got the technology to go towards a digital currency, and that will be a much better way of doing it. And it is, you know, the attaching money to debt is a stupid idea. The way to convince people is actually try to persuade them of our current system, that no one would have invent our current system. Yeah, so we got the technology, and our current system is wrong, so go to digital. But when you marry the two, I'm not with you. I'm sorry, and I think you wanted a critical feedback. For example, so if we've got this slide, this is the UK, apologies to non-UK. So this is the sort of household income by quintile group. If you gave, say, a living wage to everyone by UBI, £10,000 a year, say, or $10,000 or euros, you look at the UK. So for the people on the left-hand side of the graph, you know, fine, perfect. The people on the right-hand side of the graph and the sort of middle people, why do they need an extra £10,000 a year? It's a sort of, we're talking about, you know, £10,000 a year represents a sort of 50% of GDP you're paying out every year. You know, why give it to half the population who don't need it? There are surely lots of better things we could do with our money. Surely this is actually, you know, if you did this every year, you're going to create large economic consequences which are unforeseeable. And if what you're doing is going to work, it actually requires a great deal of redistribution. So basically, you know, the axis of the economy is, you know, the poorer people don't have access to resources, and you're giving them. So the richer people are less worse off, and that's great. I agree with it. I think we've reduced sort of our current capitalism to stupidity. You know, we've got unbelievably obscene levels of income inequality. So let's just deal with that directly. The money is there. You know, there's £4 trillion in the UK sitting in defined benefit pension money, just sitting there doing nothing, earning zero interest rates, total waste. All our capital is wasted. We don't need to invent a new system of money. And if you're going to, you know, propose something which needs to be redistributive, people, you know, there's going to be the same rejections. Oh, you can't do that, right? But so we've got to deal with this head on. You know, we can't continue going where the world gets more and more unequal. So yes, we've got to win that argument. You know, it's got to a stupid level, and we've got to redistribute. Also, I disagree with the point about that it's all caused by technology. You know, there's been a total erosion attack by governments on union power, for example, so that the wages are not. Technology is like guns. You can say, you know, when guns were invented, guns kill people. Well, no, it's not. If people kill people, but they use guns. So technology is the way people decide to use them. And anyway, so it's also, my conclusion is, yes, we need, you know, we actually have lots of money, and governments, you know, obviously borrow money, but they can borrow money at 0%. And they're choosing not to invest it. If we should move to a digital system, but I have real trouble about UBI. It just seems like you know, to give people enough money for them to live on just seems like, well, there's lots of much better things that we could and desperately need to spend our money on. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Jeff, what's your feedback? There's about 13 questions there. It's a hard job to answer them all, but take your pick.
Well, I mean, you know, on the question of whether you make an income payment to everybody or to quote those who need it, I'm open to discussion on that, obviously, because people who are equally concerned about social justice will argue that targeted welfare benefits are superior. The counter argument from UBI is that retains intrusion, and it retains the humiliation of means testing. And it means either people feel humiliated, as they do, by these very strictly sanctioned regimes, or they get the income without any conditionality. And that people who are better off, it gets channeled back through the taxation system. The other argument is that it's cheaper, therefore, because it reduces the administrative charge of your welfare system. On your question of technology, you see, I don't see that there is an argument between is it technology or is it the reduction of labour bargaining power, because I think those two are very interactive. I think that higher automation does reduce the labour bargaining power of the labour force. But the econometric work that's going on at Bath at the moment is indicating that it's the technology variable rather than the unionization variable, which better accounts for the reduced labour share. And, you know, the problem is, therefore, you could have the strongest trade unions in the world, but if technology is continually eroding employment per unit of output, they wouldn't be able to stop this reduction in aggregate wage. So I'm not against trade union power. I just don't think it's as explanatory a variable as you think.
Well, I just use union power as one example, but the way we have the globalization system, it's not a natural thing. It's like, you know, in a complex of international, you know, trade agreements, et cetera, the way capital is structured. That's not a given. You can address that. But on the question of cost, right? So, I mean, if you pay, say, £10,000, euros to everyone in the population, you know, the richer half who don't need it, that's, you know, 25% of GDP. You know, the means testing the admin on means testing doesn't cost, you know, orders of magnitude less than 25% of GDP. Yes. So I'd argue that that's like, but then if you're granting me, you know, we can direct it where it's needed, right? Then, but that's not universal basic income. That's you know, what we already have, right? Of a redistribution policy. I agree with that, right? Yeah.
If 25% of the output of the economy is through automation, then it's perfectly reasonable to pay 25% of the GDP as a universal basic income. But whether we pay it to everybody, which is the universal proposal, and tax it back from the rich, or whether we maintain the means testing system is open to debate. Many of us are not in favor of means testing because of not only its administrative cost, but the humiliating intrusion it imposes on people's living.
Okay, but then shouldn't you deal with that directly? Say, well, actually, it's not. You know, we're going to a different kind of world where, you know, actually doing stuff and consuming stuff creates environmental destruction. Doing a job, you know, let's create our own meaning in life without work. So again, dealing with the issue directly. But then let's go to a situation where robots take over the world, right? So what's happening? Amazon, right? Amazon sell everything. Jeff Bezos is, you know, the richest person in the world. He's replacing all of his, you know, replacing his people he employs with robots, right? Fine. So you'll go to a stage where there's only a few companies which own everything and don't employ anybody. And, you know, but we as an economy can produce more, but then that capitalism then actually doesn't work anymore because there's no one to buy any stuff, right? So you actually have a different problem. You actually have to, you know, go to become communist or something like that. It's the actual situation where you get fewer companies, you know, producing without employing people. Actually creates a different, you know, different dynamics to just saying, well, let's change our money system.
Yes, but it does become a more administered economy. I accept that. But if wages are not providing income, then we can no longer rely upon the firm, the employer, to provide the income, and we have to do it through the state. We need democratic methods to do that. David, are there more questions from others of the?
Yes, we have 34 questions. Let's indeed feed some of them in. There's a question by Martin Gundinger, which is almost at the top of the list, about isn't this giving too much power to governments? When a government strong enough to give you everything must be strong enough to take everything from you. What's your opinion on the dangers of this kind of total dependency from the government?
Well, I recognize it's a danger because, if you get a perverse or malign government power, then we're in trouble. But, we're in trouble if that happens anyway. I'm not arguing in favor of state control of anything. I'm arguing that there is an inevitability that income has to be channeled to people through the democratic process because it's no longer adequately being done through the employment channel. So yeah, I mean, we need to build in some very strong democratic constraints upon such a system, particularly if one of my mates ends up in charge and cuts off my basic income, for example. So yeah, I mean, it's a worry, but it's a worry if you have a malign government anyway.
Can I just also add that in support of Jeff here, actually, because if you had quite a simple UBI where everyone's just entitled to income, it sort of, in some ways, takes away the power of government because, everyone, the economy produces a certain amount, and everyone just gets a share of it, effectively. So.
There's a question by Dean Bubley, who's asking, what's the implications for exchange rates and global trade, international holdings of foreign currency in this scenario in which governments are able to create more of their own sovereign money?
Well, I think that if one government did it to excess, then of course it would cause havoc in the currency markets. But that's why we're making this project global. So we've got presence in Europe, USA, Japan, and so on. And secondly, because as I said in the presentation, the issue of sovereign money must respect the constraints of output GDP, which includes export minus import as one of its arguments. So if we simply take out the debt-funded income and the debt-funded government expenditure and call it something else that doesn't have a debt connotation, but keep the macro amounts the same, in that sort of step, as a first step, I don't see it would have any macroeconomic effects at all because it'd be the same amount of money, just differentially defined. But my argument is, it's not only my argument, of course, but our argument is as proponents of UBI, that there is an inevitability that the global production system will require income to be channeled to people other than through the workplace.
And you see that the UK could do this because the UK issues its own currency, the US, Australia, Japan, Canada, but countries in Europe, in the Eurozone, wouldn't be able to do it unilaterally. They would have to cooperate together at the level of the European Bank.
Yes,
is that
well,
correct?
Yeah, I mean, the school of MMT, modern money theory, makes this point strongly that they think that within the European Union, countries that are members of the euro, therefore subject to the ECB hegemony, couldn't therefore follow a monetary path. But whilst on the one hand, with present specifications, that may be true, then the specifications just have to be tweaked so that at European level, they can still funnel income to people. It would have completely avoided the Greek debacle, for example, if income were able to funnel to people other than through the workplace. So, the European position would have to be configured carefully through the European Union, but I don't see any fundamental objection as to why they couldn't do that. I happen to be in favor of the EU. I happen to be in favor of the euro, and I'd like to live in Schengen. But that's my particular position. But I still don't see that it can't be overcome.
Kevin Langford asks, how do we get from here to there? For example, what's going to happen to existing government debt? And what are the next steps in adopting this scheme?
I mean, I've argued that we've been bounced by the COVID crisis almost there. So, when you've got 875 billion of government debt being held by the Bank of England, it's virtually bounced us there. So it seems to me that I would then redefine the rest in the same way. Let the Bank of England buy up government debt, not at one fell swoop, although this has almost been at one fell swoop. Let it buy up government debt, cancel it because, you know, the Bank of England is wholly owned by the Treasury, is the only shareholder, so it only owes itself, cancel it and move towards a sovereign money definition. And on basic income, sure, you know, things have got to be done incrementally. So, yeah, like we have had a furlough scheme to 3 million people, I would implement a revenue neutral UBI scheme, such as my colleagues Stuart Lansley and Malcolm Torrey and others have developed, implement those as first step, and then go beyond those as we see the inadequacy of waged income increase.
Carolyn White says, thanks for this thought-provoking presentation, but can you clarify what's the role of commercial banks in this? Is it true that you are arguing, unlike Joseph Huber, that commercial banks could continue issuing money as debt?
Yeah, I am. I know Joseph and respect him and like him very much. But we do differ on this. And as Joseph will know, the Swiss referendum on sovereign money, which he very much was involved in promoting, the referendum was lost and the Swiss National Bank opposed it. And their opposition was on this issue, that they said, actually, as the National Bank, we don't have the resources, the skills, the expertise to be able to make these commercial loans. We can't handle all these SMEs coming to us with their €1 million loan proposal or their 100 million loan proposal. The commercial banks have all that. So unless you're going to nationalize those commercial banks, which is a huge and in my view rather unnecessary step, then I personally would leave money creation with the commercial banks, money creation to individuals and companies, but I would impose a seigniorage tax on them. So Joseph is worried that, well, his concern is that commercial banks will then too much cause the crisis, and that they are getting all the seigniorage. I agree with him about the seigniorage. Well, I would impose a seigniorage tax to come very close to his position where seigniorage is returned to the state. And there's no doubt, you know, seigniorage is a big value factor at the moment. So Joseph and I are working together on a team at the moment, and so he's a colleague. I have great respect for him. We have a slightly different take on this. I would say not a big different take, but yeah, a slightly different perspective.
And for those who are not familiar with the term,
can I just add, you know, okay, go on. Sorry.
I just wanted to say a little bit more about what this concept of seigniorage is. Maybe some people in the audience aren't quite clear about that.
Seigniorage, others may be able to define it better, but it's the difference between the value of the money and the cost of creating it. So if you create, you know, a £1 coin and it costs you 10p to mint it, then there's 90p of seigniorage there. And at the moment, because money is largely created electronically, you can create 100 billion as a keystroke, cost you, frankly, almost nothing, and you've created the 100 billion of value. The question is, who owns that 100 billion of value that you've created? At the moment, commercial banks gain that seigniorage because they create money out of nowhere, out of thin air. There is a magic money tree. Money is created from nothing. It has to refer to output GDP if it's to maintain its value. But that's the definition of seigniorage anyway. It's significant.
Nick?
So, yeah, there's another sort of proposal which I'm in favour of, which is like positive money, and the US economist Lawrence Kotlikoff, which is 100% reserve banking, where effectively, so don't want to go into details, not by talk, but each bank has an account with the central bank, which they do, and they're kind of they effectively just do they pass through all of the loans to the central bank, so that they're not allowed to create money anymore. They use the existing money in circulation and then make loan decisions on that basis.
Jeff, are you a fan of that positive money proposal? It sounds like you have a more liberal view.
Well, I mean, I can't, comment on other people's proposals necessarily. Positive Money are doing a great job. They seem to me to have redefined their position. They were promoting sovereign money at one point and now say to me that they're not so much promoting a sovereign money concept. And they are very critical of the operation of commercial banks. I'm sure there is a critique to be had of commercial banks, but my resolution of that critique wouldn't be to either get rid of them, or nationalize them, or withdraw their ability to create money. I would just put it in the context I've suggested.
But you suggested that the creation of more money by these commercial banks wasn't particularly to blame for the great financial crash. Whereas most people say, oh, too much money was created by these banks. You've said, well, it happened all the way around the world. People say, well, it was connected. There were the hidden connections between the different banks. They weren't even sure where all their money was. And when apparently AAA rated loans turned out to be bad, it was a house of cards. So that would argue, if that were true, for at least some more care as to what commercial banks could do.
Well, I think the question of the pyramid of derivatives and derivative instruments, the more complex instruments, is a whole talk outside of this one. Frankly, I'm not trying to avoid it, but it is a very complex scenario. And the mathematicians can create all sorts of index-linked instruments that they then sell to one another and so on. I mean, I've long been in favor of restricting the casino nature of stock markets. And I think that some sort of length of holding of stocks and so on and so forth, there are solutions to create more stability and allow less casino instruments into the economy. So I would certainly be in favor of policies which created a protection for the real economy against financial speculation. But in terms of the amount of debt put forward at consumer level, first of all, it crashed because of the mortgage debt in the USA. But the houses were perfectly built. This is the point I'm making. In the real side of the economy, the houses were there. What wasn't there was the income for people to buy them. And therefore, they're buying them on mortgages, which all fell over because the wages against which the mortgage was extended were clearly not sufficient. So it's an income problem. And if you'd seen massive loans into the consumer market, you would have seen huge inflation, which of course we didn't see. So, I'm not saying I don't have any critique of the system, I do, but I'm not in favor personally of nationalizing the whole banking system.
This question might be a bit different. There are 36 questions unanswered, and I am going to prioritize the ones that have got most thumbs up. So audience members, again, I ask you for your help. The one on the top of the list is by Dave Gordon, and he asks about a different basis for money, which is an energy standard. He says the Earth collectively receives a certain income per year in solar energy. Shouldn't we base our money on that and distribute it and live within this total budget rather than the concept you had, which was to tie it more to our effective GDP?
As I said at the beginning, I'm not a guru to answer every question. I'll try to respond to that. I mean, it seems to me that, we all want bread, food, clothing, so on and so forth. And those goods and services are what money refers to. I'm not sure, there is a separate, significant energy debate to be had. And I think I probably can't stretch my brain at this moment in time to include the energy debate into this particular proposal. But yeah, I mean, there is an energy debate to be had, but I'm not sure how you feel that energy generates income differently to the production of other goods and services. Sorry, that's not a total.
No, that's. I thought it might be an unusual question, but it had the most votes. Can
I have an attempt at that? The amount of energy, I understand it, this is off the top of my head, but I've sort of seen it quoted years ago, that falling on the Earth is massively more than humans actually use. So I don't think that we're kind of, order of magnitude away from that boundary. We just capture a tiny fraction of it. So then would you link it to, our energy production, which are kind of ends up being a bit like gold, right? Because you can increase gold standard, you can increase energy production. So I sort of don't. It hasn't got a close enough relationship to our economic activity. We could expand our before we ever hit that barrier of energy coming from the sun.
In the old days, when London Futurists met physically in Birkbeck College, at this stage, I would say, let's continue this particular discussion in the pub. Fascinating, but maybe slightly tangential. Evan Parker asks, will there be pensions in your vision, given that the UBI will be paid to everybody?
Oh, yes, there'll be pensions, Again, I'd need to have time to work this scheme out more completely, and how people, for example, with disabilities, how people with specific additional income requirements are treated within the scheme is all issues which need to be defined. So yeah, I mean, I think pensioners would need UBI. I think the present pension schemes, even with the recent reforms, are leaving some people with inadequate incomes in their old age. So I think the inadequacy of the current pension schemes argues even more strongly for UBI.
Paul Harnett asks, if you were advising the Central Bank of Mozambique, would you be suggesting they would set up UBI in the same way that maybe the UK and the USA can do?
Well, interesting. I also noticed my colleague Diana Bashur is on the call, and Diana is working on the UBI in post-conflict situations. We were discussing only a couple of days ago how this might apply in a war-ravaged environment like Syria. And when you analyze how people, even in that situation, currently buy their food, and what the income flows are to do that, and where the money is coming from, in this case, loans from Russia or Iran, the possibility of replacing that with sovereign, debt-free sovereign money issued by the Syrian government in Syrian pounds, yes, is a serious proposal.
And I have heard it said that in some ways UBI is more straightforwardly applicable in countries that don't have quite a complex and sophisticated existing social network system, where there's much less to start off with. Then a UBI can do a lot more good a lot more quickly. A broader question, which is in view of the potential large number of positive outcomes of your project, how are central bankers reacting to it? Are they saying, well, yeah, we should be adopting it, or are they just ignoring it?
Well, it's interesting because after 5 years of trying, I have got lined up for next Tuesday a presentation to the Bank of England's internal research seminar. So I'll be better positioned to answer that question after Tuesday. But let it be said, there are several people who have been significant figures in the financial sector of the UK. I'd include people like Adair Turner in that, former head of the FSA, who are very much in favor and making slide presentations in favor of sovereign money. So there is a paradigm shift going on. And it's by no means impossible to persuade central banks of the rightness of debt-free sovereign money when that is what they're currently doing.
Question from Ian Beveridge about taxing robots effectively. I mean, he says there has been talk of taxing productivity rather than profit or income, making machine productivity as taxable. Is that something that you would give support to, or is it again tangential to your main thesis?
It's a bit tangential because I'm trying to avoid funding basic income by tax. You see, at the moment, I don't think we need consumption drawing out of the economy. I'd need to beg time to think about that question a bit more. I mean, I have seen it discussed around the place, but I put it in the category that I'm not able to answer all questions. I acknowledge the sense of the question, but I'm not looking for taxation sources in my paradigm.
Okay, so it's fair to say that you haven't worked out all the details of what could be a complex system, but what about the basics, such as how much UBI, this is a question from Yates Buckley, what level of UBI do you think will be covered by your proposal? Is it enough to subsist on, or enough to drive strategic directions in the economy?
Well, it's enough to subsist on. So, I mean, if you take the 250 billion or whatever it is out of, I have got a separate presentation on this, on aggregate amounts. The proposal made by Citizens Basic Income Trust costs about 168 billion to my memory in total. Now, that's funded by some increase in tax, as I say, and a reduction of other benefits. So you'd withdraw means tested benefits to pay for it. So when you scale it against the fact that in 2004, 164 billion of extra household debt was taken out. Now, scaled against that, I'd replace that 164 billion immediately by a basic income. So I'm getting to levels that don't cover all of income, but make a significant contribution to people's living requirements. And my other argument, of course, comes from automation. Therefore, if, for example, 25% of the GDP were demonstrated to being produced automatically, then 25% of that GDP becomes the basic income. So, you know, I mean, again, I hold my hand up, but I don't have a fully budgeted project for UBI. Those do already exist. The Compass one is one, the CBIT is another one. I'd start with those, and then I'd build forward from there.
Let's take a question from Alex Howlett. Are low-paid jobs always the bullshit jobs, and the high-paid jobs never? Do you want to say more about how important this concept of bullshit jobs is to your recommendations?
No, well, yes and no. Alex and I, hi Alex, we've discussed this before. I mean, I refer to that because that is in the consciousness since David, whose surname I forget, raised this label for low satisfaction job surveys. There are apparently, and again, I don't have the references in my mind to this, but there are significant surveys demonstrating low job satisfaction. And as you rightly say, perhaps at all levels. So the question that work isn't always the dignity, doesn't always confer the dignity that we think it does or hope that it does. And therefore, my argument philosophically would be on that question, which you raised earlier, that our dignity is inherent. We don't have dignity if we work and not have dignity if we don't work. There are clearly a lot of people who don't work. Of course they have dignity. And therefore we may face another paradigm where we work less. You know, we used to work 100 hours a week, then we worked 70 hours a week, now we work 35 hours a week. And as Keynes said, and he was only wrong by a question of time, we may end up working 15 hours a week or a 4-day week or whatever. That means some reconstruction of our attitude to life. We've shown that we're perfectly happy to make that adaptation over the last century. And if it means a little bit more leisure or a little bit more time that we ourselves decide what creative activity we wish to do and don't have it imposed by the 8 to 4 factory or the 9 to 5 office, then fine. So all I'm doing there is reflecting the common consciousness that work isn't always satisfying. Hopefully it can be, but it isn't always. It's a myth, in other words, that this is the great savior of humanity, is to go to the office.
And David Graeber, came up with this concept, used to say, sadly he passed away last year, but he used to say that he would raise the concept of bullshit jobs in his seminars, slightly unseriously, and many people would come up to him afterwards and say, please don't tell my boss, but I think frankly my job is pretty bullshit. Often was to just help his boss have a larger empire, to give some, and the 5 different categories of bullshit jobs as I remember. So it does seem that there's a lot of money being given to people to do things that aren't actually that productive. And if we were rational, we would find ways to spread these resources without this dysfunctional aspects to them.
David Graeber actually didn't mean them to be particularly low-paid jobs. They're more jobs like, you know, compliance officer or something like that, which the people who did it felt were meaningless, but they would tended to be sort of white-collar clerical jobs rather than the low-paid.
I wouldn't want to suggest that all compliance officers are doing a poor job, and I would like to say that many compliance officers are doing vital jobs.
Yes, exactly. No, sorry, I was white collar. Just on the previous question about Mozambique and poor countries, there was a proposal from the World Academy of Arts and Science, which I came across, where there's a sort of for the creation of money by an entity like the IMF, and therefore given to poor people around the world, so which ran in parallel to normal currencies, and that seems a pretty sound proposal. So I hand back over to you, David.
Thanks. Well, we're coming towards the end. We'll take a couple more questions, I think. and we'll try and give a chance for some concluding remarks as well. One of the questions I'd like to address is about this idea of radical centrism, which is, according to Dill Green, there's a risk that if it has no reference to politics, it's never going to get anything done. Policy is decided by politics. And so maybe you could just say a little bit more. What is this concept? I mean, this is more for you, Nick.
Can't Jeff answer this question? Radical. No, it's not that there's no politics. Obviously, in fact, quite the opposite. It's just that the sort of politics we're stuck with of the old-fashioned labels of left and right are meaningless. And a lot of Radix's work is how you get good ideas. So if you into the political system. It's more that we're not aligned to the old parties and old sort of, ideologies. And I think it would be a politics of pragmatism. You know, there are lots of problems that we can all agree on. Like there's, we've got environmental crisis, we've got too much inequality and stuff. And it's actually how we address those problems. And the political process is about getting consensus and building coalitions which can get policies through. And you understand that political process through looking at it as a system, right? So we don't deny there's politics, but just and also politics isn't given. So the political system in Denmark, for example, which helps coalitions, is very different to the one in the USA, which we can see which causes polarization in its structural design. So if you can get reform and kind of new ideas about how decisions get made, for example, like deliberative democracy, and technology does allow us, promising future of how we can get more participative democracy. So it's sort of against the politics of the past, which we seem to be stuck with, and looking at how we can change politics to make it much more productive and maybe disruptive.
So I remember from looking at the set of fellows and board members of Radix, there are people from previously from quite different parties able to contribute in their own diverse ways to the work of the organization. Question about technology from Dean Bubley about the role potentially of AI to improve the welfare system by being a lot more precise and targeted. You have said it's a very complex and administrative system. You have said that the current conditionality is demeaning, but you've also said it's heavy and burdensome to administer. Shouldn't we be expecting AI, one of the many things it might do, to streamline this and to allow, therefore, more conditionality rather than just a universality of benefits?
Yeah, I think that's one possibility, but you still face the question as to whether you're going to means test people, and whether that has humiliating aspects to it. And if you can design an AI system which targets benefits accurately without a means testing, but inevitably you are asking about people's situations, and we all know how the regimes of universal credit, for example, become very intrusive, very harsh, and very demeaning. So I worry about systems which delve into people's personal lives. You look at the PIP system that we have at the moment for people with disability, and frankly, I had to complete one of those recently, not for myself, but for someone else. And they're extraordinarily demeaning. There's 27 pages of very detailed questions about people's needs in life. And so I tend to back off anything which is delving into people's personal lives more deeply, even if it's enabled by AI. On one hand, technologically, that might solve it. On the other hand, are we treating the recipient with respect?
Where about in the world do you think this is likely to happen first?
Well, whoever we can all persuade first. I think that clearly, there are various pilots, as you know, around the place. A pilot happened in Finland, a pilot happened in Namibia, a pilot may happen in Scotland, and so on. I think that the pilots, whilst welcome in one sense, because they raise awareness of the basic income idea, it's a question of what we're piloting. And we come out of the pilots saying, well, when people had secure income, they felt better, their well-being was higher. Great, but I think that that's pretty predictable. I think we knew that in advance. I want to see a macroeconomic pilot of basic income so that we test these ideas across the whole economy. I can't gaze into a crystal ball and say who'll do it first, but I hope that we will gain the persuasive groundswell to bring it into being in the UK, and of course other people on this call are from Europe and the States and Japan and so on, to see it implemented there. So I guess I'm not that concerned as to who's first, as long as we get it rolled out.
But every initiative needs to be a little bit focused on likely first success points. If we spread ourselves out very thinly, the famous message of startups in business, we're likely to fail everywhere.
Well, not if you, I mean, if you're seeking to persuade, quite easy to persuade globally at the moment, as this conference call shows. And the question then is, where do you see the beginnings of an acceptance of the argument? At the moment, in government levels, there are small beginnings in terms of policies of the political parties. And one minute you feel that some progress has been made, and then the next minute it's cancelled out. So I don't find that question. I'd love to be able to answer it and say it's going to be Japan, but I just don't know. At the moment, I don't think we are spreading too thinly, because again, the technology allows us to publish quite powerfully, really.
You've answered a lot of questions on all kinds of subjects. I'll give you a chance in a minute or two, Jeff, to make some final remarks on any point you think deserves to be uppermost in people's minds. Nick, I'll come to you in a minute as well if you have any final comments. But first, for me, I would like just to say a few quick words about what's happening next with London Futurists. Today, we've been hearing about sovereign money creation and basic income. In 3 weeks' time, we're looking at something quite different, which is a very old question, but with a possible new slant and implications for the future. The old question is, where does consciousness come from? Which is separate from where does intelligence come from. And the speaker will be a neuropsychologist and psychoanalyst from South Africa, who has done lots of research over the years. And his work on where consciousness arises from in the brain has quite interesting implications for the question of, will our robots in the future ever be conscious as well? And what would this mean, and how soon might it happen? So that's in 3 weeks' time. And looking further ahead, there's an even bigger topic, which is, might some of the technology that is being developed now, might some of the damage we're doing to the environment now not just be inconvenient, not just cause inequality, but in some sense trigger the end of the whole world? So the speaker there argues that we should look back at what people have previously predicted and thought and proposed about possible ends of the world. And he will argue that things really are potentially different this time around. So these are the two meetings that are in the agenda currently for the future. There are others which will probably be announced soon, so please keep your eye open on the usual places. Nick, would you like to offer any final thoughts now that you've had a few minutes to put your ideas in order?
Oh, well, first of all, I mean, tackling, not exactly tackling small topics, the end of the world and consciousness. So, I mean, Jeff has, it's in some ways slightly persuaded me, because the current system with massive monetary policy bailout not working, we sort of, our current financial system is reductio ad absurdum. We're in the ad absurdum bit. So it's not going to work, and it's not working. It's failed, and we're looking for alternatives. So, and in that case, I think all options are on the table. I mean, I agree with you about digital money, non-debt related is actually, to me, fairly obvious. slightly disagree about the mechanisms, but and the about what you do with banks, but that's a quibble. I'm not really convinced about UBI, but then actually, if we did go to a world with AI replacing computers, so AI replacing jobs, then we need to go somewhere along that route. And as I said, I think there's a really good, would massively benefit, never mind us in wealthy countries, massively benefit humanity as a whole if we had UBI for a global UBI, obviously at a much lower level, but that would massively increase human welfare. So thanks to David for organising such a great event, and thanks to Jeff for such an eloquent, thought-provoking presentation.
Jeff.
Well, my thanks again to everybody who's come and joined in the conference, to David and to Nick for doing the organising. I'll try and get a bit of lighting consultant for my next presentation. But yeah, I mean, in summary, my argument has been and remains that in high-tech economies, a basic income and debt-free sovereign money are essential. And I support that argument by the fact of their existence as surrogates today, i.e. the surrogate of household debt and the surrogate of government debt. And I want us to be real about those and to redefine them as to what they should be defined as, i.e. Basic income and debt-free sovereign money. And I hope that I've made a case that at least might be considered partially persuasive.
Well, we did hear that Nick had been partially persuaded by at least some of your remarks, and I see the audience sending lots of thanks in the chat window. I'm sorry we don't have time to answer all the questions, but we did answer the ones that the wisdom of the crowd selected. And the other ones I will forward to Jeff. He may look at them, and some of them may give him ideas to alter his thinking in the future. So thanks for that. And it just leaves me to say thanks to Radix for co-hosting this event and for helping to spread publicity about it. And a special thanks to Jeff, who has, as I hoped, he has given some big ideas in context, which makes a great deal of sense. Some of the audience obviously wish to take more time to think about things, but they can find more from you, Jeff, on various websites. Do you want to just mention them briefly?
Yeah, I mean, the ubi.org website is the one to look at because that refers to several other links.
And how did you manage to get website ubi.org?
A bit of subtle connivery. I found it available in the USA, actually, so I had to buy it. But yeah,
well,
just in time.
Congratulations on that, and congratulations on being such an inspiring speaker today. Thanks, everybody.